Welcome, everybody. I'm Clinton Carlson, and University of Notre Dame, and I want to just welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. We expect a few more to join us, but we got a few just introductions. Some of you have joined us in previous sessions, and it might be a little bit of repeat, but we have exciting session for you today, we hope. Rodrigo and I, this initiative really started a year ago through a Luksic family grant that is meant to connect Northern Cone and Southern Cone research institutions. And Rodrigo and I applied for that. The intention of that is really to foster further research that aligns with this interdisciplinary space across cultures. It's also to connect our institutions and connect us to designers, in our case, around the world, we hope. It's also to bring in people like our speakers today to help expand our knowledge and our knowledge in this space of emergency management. We've partnered with Sigadin and the Design Network for Emergency Management. They've been supportive of this and been a partner with us in this. We hope that continues and will build as we continue through these sessions and roundtables and our research. Our research began in January here at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. We did 4 workshops, 2 focused on food security issues and imagining a way that we can reduce overreaction during emergencies around food security issues. And another 2 workshops were focused on emergency management at the local level. How do we foster participatory sessions that can bring emergency responders together with the public to think about the scenarios of emergencies. The goal of that is one, to allow the public to have a voice in a room that often they're excluded from. Also to represent individuals that maybe aren't considered, people who aren't able-bodied or don't speak the native language, those types of things. Also, we hope that our tests and our research in this area will help foster a lower fidelity way for emergency response organizations, communities, and campuses, things like that, to think through new emergencies that might be due to global warming or political unrest or things that haven't been common in that space. And so that's been our project this far. We'll be doing additional workshops in Santiago testing these same questions. We really are trying to work in 2 scales. One, at a larger scale when it comes to food recalls and food security issues. How do we work and design for larger systems that might impact broad cultures and societies? And then at the micro scale of how do we help local communities plan and facilitate and reduce emergency issues before, during, and after emergencies. So that's kind of where we've been in terms of our research, where the project came out of. And I'm going to hand it over to Rodrigo to talk a little bit about these sessions and then introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you, Clinton, and welcome everyone to this 3rd session of the Roundtable series of Design for Emergencies. I would like also to make first a short brief of the previous sessions. In the first session, we had with the topic of tsunami evacuation, the presentation by Claudine Janichen, Cognition and Wayfinding for Disaster Planning, and then Jorge León from USM Valparaíso, Chile, Fostering Tsunami Resilience Through Vertical Evacuation. 2 topics that sparked a lot of discussion, a lot of inspiration for people from a critical topic that is the evacuation in a tsunami scenario. Then in the session 2, as Clinton mentioned before, we had the topic of food security with Carl DiSalvo from Georgia Tech in Atlanta, the US, with the topic Design for Foraging, considering the use of technologies to support provisional care. And then Mateo Rubio from Cascara Foods, a Chilean startup, with the question, what if we use food waste? Again, to discussion topics on how to consider different approaches to deal with food security issues in a context of normality, but also in a eventual context of emergency. What happened with overreaction, or what happened with participatory approaches facilitated by technology, as we said before. We have in all the sessions we have the collaboration of CIGIDEN, the Research Center for the Management of Disasters in Chile, and especially I would like to mention the Design Network for Emergency Management. Claudine Jaenichen is part of the Design Network for Emergency Management, and Klaus Kremer was the moderator in the previous session. Today, we have, again, two speakers. We are so grateful for their presentations today. Elizabeth Wagemann with the topic More Than Shelters, Transitional Housing After Disasters. And then Magdalena Radrigán will bring risk communication in post-disaster recovery, what we need to know and what we need to do. Here, sorry, I forgot to mention, the topic today is design after disaster. So I hope that we will have, again, a very profound discussion. You are more than invited to ask your questions, to integrate in your own fields the ideas that we are discussing together. In the role of moderator today will be Emily Harris. Emily is a designer and is a visiting professor now at the Notre Dame's design department. So we are so happy to host you, Emily, here today. If you want to introduce yourself and introduce the first presenter, please take the voice.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I am, like Rodrigo said, I'm a visiting professor here at Notre Dame, and do a lot of work around research and strategy within design, and disaster relief is definitely something of interest there. So happy to get a closer look at this project. But without further ado, I want to welcome Elizabeth Wagemann. I'm sorry if I, please correct me on my pronunciation there, but she is the director of the City and Territory Lab at the University of Diego Portales in Chile. She has her master's in architecture from UC Chile and a PhD in architecture from the University of Cambridge in UK. And her topic today is More Than Shelter, Transitional Housing After Disasters. So thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth, and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen then. Okay, and I'm going to put my time, otherwise I'm going to talk longer than expected. Yeah. So there is some microphone on, I think. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, thanks for the invitation to talk today about transitional housing. This is a topic that I've been studying for almost 15 years now, so time flies. And I'm going to approach this topic through 3 points. First, transitional housing, what are the definitions? Secondly, what experiences we have about housing design, transitional housing design. And the third point is more than shelter. Why is more than just a roof over to protect us from the environment? So let's start with the first line, the first point, transitional housing definitions. There are no one definition. There are different definitions of transitional shelter, housing, temporary housing, of course. And as you can see here, there are different approaches. Of course, after the emergency, the families and people affected, they need an emergency situation where to protect themselves from the environment and from the climate. And they will have or not, as you can see in the image, a tent, or they go to a collective center, for example. Then you can see from Quarantelli, he's a sociologist that studied post-disaster housing, and he defined that there were, or he found 4 phases. First, the emergency shelter, that could be a tent, could be a collective shelter also, but then a temporary shelter that might be something very lightweight, and then a temporary housing, something more sturdy, and then over the years, families or the communities, they were able to get permanent housing. But you can see here that also there are others that see the housing, the process of housing after a disaster in 3 phases. First, the emergency shelter, that also can be a tent, then the transitional shelter, that might be something that goes between the emergency and the permanent housing, that is going to happen some years after the disaster. But also Ian Davis, that also studied post-disaster, he says that, and advocates for only 2 phases, saying that we don't need to have this transitional moment. We need to go directly from the emergency shelter to the permanent housing. And the ways to do that might be through subsidies, or, for example, to rent, to going to families' houses. But as you can imagine, in some cases, that is not feasible. And then also there are others, like the shelter center, that they said we should have a continuous phase where you provide, or the families, they get a solution that can go from something very simple that in process is going to be transformed into a permanent house. So you can see that there might be different ways to approach this phase between the emergency and the permanent housing. And what we're talking today about is this transitional period, this transitional stage between the emergency and the permanent housing solution. But this continuous phase, so is you go to the same transitional shelter idea of this continuous process, it might be also very similar to other processes that are, for example, used for development or have been used for development in different countries, like the core house, where one room, for example, is provided, and then the families, they extend this core house and they can get to this transition or this process to the permanent house. Or the semi-permanent house, that might be some panels, or, for example, a house with wheels, like a mobile home, for example, that later is going to be transformed into a permanent house. Or sites and services that were very common in the 70s in different parts in Latin America, where the plot, the land was provided, and with some connections to sanitation, for example, and water, and then the families, they were building the house during the process. So this transition, this idea of the continuous phase also is something that is quite connected to the permanent solution. But again, and as Magdalena knows, it's a very complicated situation when you have a transitional house that is installed, that is stays for longer than expected, and it might be very difficult for the families living there to get to the permanent house, and it might be very complicated. I'm not going to go into detail in that, but we can have that in the conversation later. So my second point is regarding the design. So what type of designs have been used over the years. And I really like always to show, I really enjoy this image, because people think that transitional shelter, transitional housing is something new, is something that is happening in the past 20 years, or something that maybe because it's more in the media, more in the newspapers. However, we have some very old experiences here. You can see these images from the Darwin's expedition to Chile, and he happens to be here when we have an earthquake in Concepcion in 1835. And this image shows temporary huts built by rich people that they wanted to collaborate to more vulnerable communities, and they built these temporary huts after this earthquake. So we can see that the design of these solutions were as maybe like probably they go even further in time, but this is one of the images that we have from Chile that is not show us that it's not something new in terms of design. Also, we can see this image in San Francisco after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. These shacks built by the Union of Carpenters and the Army Corps. And also, again, you can see that this type of solutions are very similar to the ones that we're using even today. Also, we know that disasters are not only created by natural hazards, and here we can see some solutions being used after other type of emergency, other type of disaster after the Second World War. On the right side, you can see the Quonset huts using in the US, and also the mobile homes that are still in use, not the same design, but they were very extensive used after the Second World War. And also not in the US, but also in Europe, in London, they use something very similar to the Quonset huts, the Nissen huts, with a very similar design, very military, like this kind of barracks used for providing housing. And also other type of solutions, like type of prefabricated panels used also in the UK. And I was able in the UK to visit some of these houses that are still in use. So you can see this transition lasted for 80 years. And some of them, they were very well conserved. Some of them, of course, not. Of course, they needed a lot of refurbishment, but they were not created for the long term. They were created for a temporary period of time. Also, we have some experiences from innovators such as Mr. Fuller and also Jean Prouvé, trying to provide a more innovative design, to bringing design into these temporary houses, maybe too futuristic in some cases, and this idea from Mr. Fuller of this better, so after the war, how we can rebuild our lives, and on the right side, Jean Prouvé with this house for better days, so it's telling you everything with that name. We also have really bad experiences from innovators and from some NGOs trying to create new and novel solutions. For example, here on the left side, we can see this emergency housing provided by Oxfam in India and Turkey, and on the right side, by the German Red Cross in Turkey, Peru, and Nicaragua. And in both cases, the materials, the shapes, the solutions were really not adequate for the communities. On the right side, for example, they used a flammable material for communities that used open fire for cooking. So you can imagine that the complications of that type of solutions, and also very alien for the type of houses that they had in the community. Never a dome, so people, they really didn't want to live there because it was alien for them. But at the same time, they were far from transport services and another infrastructure from the city. Going more into contemporary solutions, also very well published, the another Khalili solutions, the sandbag shelters on the left, and on the right side, Shiyuban with the paperlock houses. And also those solutions were very, very published, however, very niche, not really replicated in many cases for many reasons. The difficulty of building something, for example, with sandbags on the right side with paper that were only created for this type of housing. So they were not a reuse of this kind of paper logs, these big cylinders. They were created only for that type of solution. So not really easy to replicate. In reality, in the past years, what is being used, or the kind of solutions that are being used, are this type of designs. On the left, Habitat for Humanity in Haiti, very simple structures, in many cases with tarpaulins or with plastic covering the walls. So families, they could use a different material to create the panels and then to consolidate this transitional housing. And on the right side, a solution by Techo. After the 2010 earthquake in Chile, we changed the standards, but in terms of design, it's quite similar. The new design is more like this. The panels, they have more insulation, are different. They are bigger, the houses, but it's very similar to the other design. So something to reflect, or to maybe to criticize here from my perspective, is to, even though we have been doing the same you can see, for more than 100 years, it's quite similar, the type of solutions, we still could improve this type of solutions, including climate, including some necessities, some culture influences. Even though they can be prefabricated, they can be solutions that can be replicated, but still we have many possibilities to change that. So when I was doing my master's thesis in Cambridge, I tried to understand what type of solutions we could find. So I tried to understand what type of solutions universities created, architects, the industry, government, NGOs. And as you can see here, many of them, and you can see on top of the images, you have the plans. Some of them were very complicated with very complicated shapes, also not only in the plan, the area, but also complicated shapes, different complicated materials. But in reality, as I was saying, the type of solutions that are being used are the simpler ones, the more replicated, easy to replicate ones. And in black and also in dark gray, you can see the ones that are used in a massive scale. So those are the type of solutions that really have an impact at the end, more than the very innovative solutions in terms of design. So those are the type of the timber house in Chile that now has been improved also, is the one that we used, for example, in our country. So that was the definitions, design, and then why is more than shelter. And here I have 3 points, so sub-points. More than shelter, because the families, they need decent housing, even if it's a transitional solution. They need some dignity. Transition to what? That is one of the main questions. So what are going to transition? So what is going to happen after this period of time? And then the home as also a workspace, as a space for production, because for many families, the house is more than just a roof. So when we talk about decent housing, even if it's temporary, well, of course, as I said to you, we improve this design. So it's not this mediagua, this kind of emergency housing with this timber shaft, this timber shack solution. Now we have something better, but for the time after the 2010 earthquake, even the government was able to understand that they needed to improve their solutions. They provide recommendations for improvement of this transitional housing in terms of structure, in terms of insulation, and so the families, they started adding this kind of primavita, these sheets for insulation of the shelters, but also from outside to waterproof the shelters with plastic solutions, so they could cope with the winter in some areas. But also when we talk about dignity and decent housing, it's because some families, they know that they're going to be living there for more than 2-3 years. And some of them, they provide the houses and they need to do it because it's something connected with dignity. How my facade is going to look for this period of time, and they start adding other characteristics, personal characteristics to the house. And you can see here, not in the south of Chile, but in a more recent disaster in Diego del Magdalena, 2015, also how the houses, these new type of models, were improved by the families with verandas, and also not only in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of protecting from the weather. So the second point is transition to what? And as you can see here, I put on top the very simple scheme of the house provided at the beginning, and the arrows show how and where the families were extending this temporary transitional housing. And I studied many cases in Chile and also in Peru after 2 different earthquakes, and earthquake and tsunami. And I realized that when the families, they received the same prototype, the same model, and after 1 year, they extended in a very sensitive way, and then the second year even more. And I tried to find what were the patterns. So the main pattern was that they extended as big as they could. So you can see here, so they started with all the families with 18 square meters, and then after 2 years, some of them, they went even to 84 square meters, even though the families, they knew that they needed to move after a period of time, because they didn't have land tenure. They knew that the site, the plot was not them and for them, and then they needed to disassemble the house and destroy it. But it's still, the families, what they do is to extend as big as they could to accommodate their needs. Again, in terms of patterns, they extended in any way they could if they have the materials and the space available. So that was the main pattern at the end. And also this transition to what, when some families, they were able to get the permanent housing from different size subsidies or building by themselves. As you can see here behind, hidden, the transitional house being used as part of an extension. So it's also for the families, because at least in Chile, it's the families, they receive this transitional house, and it's for them, so they can use it in different ways. And the third point, more than shelter, is that home, in many cases, even before the disaster, the families, the house, they use it as a space for production. Many of our communities, the families, they use the house for repair, for sales, for services, for production, for growing plants that are going either to sell, or they're going to use it for their own food. And also, so I wanted to study what is happening there. And as Shepard and Hill, they say, home-based enterprises or home-based work are the most single important income source for the populations most affected by disaster. I'm sorry. So in this example, we can see a woman using the porch of their temporary house as a shop. And also in Chile, we also saw that the temporary shelters used for that, for example, fishing shops, or for selling stuff, storage, equipment. So it's important to understand that for the families, especially for the vulnerable communities, the house is more than just a space, for a domestic space, just for sleeping. It's also being used for other uses. And so with that in mind, in 2020, we started this study. Beth Simmons and Victoria Maynard, we wrote a chapter for interaction where we explored the relationship between shelter and home-based enterprises and how that affected the recovery after humanitarian crisis. And then we also did a literature review, and basically we found that there was not much written about it, and not many very systematic studies about that. And so I, with my team in Chile, we started with a pilot study, and we started doing some research, understanding in 2 case studies in Atacama region about the relationship between domestic and working space in emergency housing. And we are conducting that research now. So I'm going to finish here with this understanding as the home as something else. And you can see from these images that we are creating with our team, where you can see the original, the transitional shelter, and how the families use some of the extensions, not only for example, a kitchen or the dining area, but also for making a pastry for sale, or extension that are being used as a chicken coop for selling the eggs, or for using it in the pastry that they are going to sell later. So in the understanding that for the families, especially in this transitional period, that as Magdalena probably she's going to agree that sometimes we don't want this period to be that long, but it happens in many cases, and to understand that the house is being used as something else. So the home as a space, a productive space. So that was me. Thank you so much, and I hope we can have a nice conversation later.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. I have lots of follow-up questions to that. But without further ado, we'll save all those questions for the end for both Elizabeth and Magdalena. I want to introduce Magdalena, our next speaker. She is a disaster communications specialist. She's also a journalist at USACH Chile. She has her MA in Strategic Communication from UIA Chile and her MS in International Disaster Management from the University of Manchester, UK. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. Thanks for participate in this instance, and thanks for inviting me to share something about of risk communication. I'm going to share presentation. Whoop. Yes. Can you check if you can see the presentation? Okay, great, thanks. Well, first, well, as Emily presents me, it's in a different way. Elizabeth presents about emergency housing. I'm going to talk about something related. Maybe the conversation at the end we can share about these different topics related to emergency housing and risk communication. So let me. Okay, well, sorry. Well, I'm going to talk about the communication related to the recovery phase of the disaster, and especially what we need to know and what we need to do. In Chile, it's very difficult to talk about risk communication because there is a topic that is not included at the journalism schools. So that is one of the challenges that we need to work on it. And well, excuse me, sorry. I have a problem here with, here it is. Okay, that's okay. Well, we know that disasters change social, cultural, and economical practices and shift the future of a territory and its community. We know that we suffer this change. There is an image with a little girl with a mask. During the pandemic, we have to change a lot of practices. It's just an image that shows us what disaster impact in our lives. But we need to talk about what is communication. If I'm going to talk about risk communication first, it's important to understand what is communication. Comunicare is it's a Latin word, and it means the action to share by a common shared code. So when we are talking about communication, we're talking about to share some codes. And it's important to notice that managing communication is a big challenge because what is reported inadequately, untimely, or without clear objectives generates confusion, disarticulates any planning to reduce risk, and alters the understanding of the facts. Disasters are instances that we know that impact in our lives, as I mentioned before, and interrupt our normal activities, causing losses and injuries and many times death. So it's very important to manage communication related to all the phases of the disasters, but we are going to focus on recovery phase. There is this is an important idea that I think explain a lot. Communication can help to prevent or reduce a disaster, as well as ineffective or non-existent communication can cause a disaster or make a situation worse. That is the importance of communication. We need to be super careful about what we are going to report, what we are going to inform, because if we don't manage an effective communication, we can make a situation worse. So that is it's just to mention that how important is the ideas, the data, and what we need to inform. So in that way, what we need to know about that. What is risk communication? Well, risk communication, maybe you you heard a lot of this topic during COVID-19 pandemic. Risk communication, in simple, refers to an interchange between, well, in real time, between people who needs to manage a hazard or a disaster, and the people who are exposed to it. Okay, the literature on disaster risk management understand risk communication as a relevant factor in disaster planning, response, and recovery. So it identifies as an important topic related to all the phases of the disaster cycle, as maybe you know. We know that disaster management cycle included mitigation, preparation, and after the disaster occurs, identify the response and the recovery phase. So to think about a strategic communication, it has to be linked to a disaster risk reduction plan. That is super important, because to improve some, to create just in the moment the emergency happen, it's not the best idea to work on how we are going to communicate all the data and all the information that is related to that fact. So it's important to think that first we need to have a strategy to manage all the different phases of the disaster. Okay, and to design communication strategies has to be think to promote the protection of life of all the community without overriding basic humanitarian, ethical, and technical principles. That is so important. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk why it's very important to focus on it. And communicating at different phases of the disaster, here I'm going to identify some practices. For example, during the before the emergency, before the disaster, in the preventive actions, we can identify activities related to drills, to share information, different campaigns, for example, to inform to the community what they have to do to identify safe places, also to share information about which are the early warning systems they can use or which are available to identify in case these early warning systems are used during the emergency. Then during the disaster, the activities related to communication are related to report actions and what the authority needs to communicate. For example, providing details about where are the places that the shelters are going to be able for the people, or which are the hospitals or the sanitary system available for in case they need health attention. And also delivery of aid. For example, it's important not just for the people that are suffering the disaster, but also to people who want to support the community. So in special is during the disaster, we have to communicate about information for the families and friends of the victims, and that is how you can identify what to do or what to communicate, during this phase. But when we are talking after the disaster occurs, so during the response and also the recovery, well, we can talk recovery, we can separate later in reconstruction process. But in the post-disaster phase, it's important that to focus the information related to reconstruction and rehabilitation actions. For example, the campaigns to promote donations of food, medicine, clothes, tools, and household goods from the public. Also, which are going to be, or the solutions or the social measures that the authority is going to propose to the affected territories and communities. So after the disaster happens, the communication needs to be focused on the activities or the help that is available for people suffering the emergency. And It's important to understand that what we need to focus on is related. We need to think what is happening to people suffering the disaster. It's important to notice that people who are suffering, they go through stages, different stages. They need to hear, because as I mentioned before, risk communication is this interchange between authorities and the people who suffer or are exposed to risk. They need to understand what is happening and which are the solutions. For example, where if they are able to receive an emergency housing, for example, or where are going to be the shelters available to go with their families, and all the time the question, as we live in each disaster, is how long we have to stay in those places. So there are a lot of things that happen during this situation, during and especially after the disaster happened, during the response stage, that people needs to go through these different stages, and in this way they shape their perceptions about the risk and also their subsequent behavior related to this. So this is important to mention because all these things affect the communication. So it's important to keep in mind about that. So in that way, literature recognizes different actions to reduce the exposed to hazards. One of them is improve public awareness. Also, I mentioned the early warning mechanism, and to check the disaster response system. But how we can improve public awareness is we need to use communication, risk communication, and in a way to educate the population about disaster. So information disaster is a key. What we need to know is that in an emergency, the timely and transparent information is relevant. It's important to provide information timely, rapid, and to offer an adequate response to people affected, and especially because it's necessary to build trust and credibility. As I mentioned before, people during disaster are exposed to a lot of feelings and they are suffering, so it's important to build credibility about the authorities who are providing information and solutions. We know that everyone seeks and needs information for what to make decisions. It's important to know what is going to happen, because in that way they can make decisions to protect their own and their families. And it's important to recognize that during disasters, the information comes from different sources and represents different points of view. And also it responds to different interests. So you have to be very careful about what the information you're going to share. And in that way, the media plays an important role. As Sendai mentioned, media needs to contribute to the raising of public awareness and understanding, and disseminate accurate and non-sensitive disaster risk, hazard, and disaster information. So it's important to mention because, well, here in Chile, and it happens unfortunately in many other countries, the media sometimes has no idea what is the best way to report during disasters. Usually, in special TV, during disaster, they try to try to take care about people, but not all the time they present it in the best way. Okay, it's an ethical approach to be careful about people who are suffering, to communicate about preventive measures, and they need to play a role related to the best way to community recovery and rehabilitation. It's important to notice that in the media, influence people's attitudes and emotions and impact on their security. And it's important also to recognize that what they are informed is not experienced just by people who are directly affected. The media also impacts on the people who consume that media. So in that way, it's important to identify which is the role that the media plays on disaster. This image we can identify in many reports, because it's identified that sometimes the journalists during disaster used to hack people, and well, this is not the best way, because they try to feel so close, but it's not the best way. We are going to identify later, but it's important to notice that journalistic work in disasters are under high pressure and, of course, and complex conditions. For everyone, if you had to work in an uncomfortable places, for example, with a lot of smoke, if you are covering a wildfire, it's not the best scenario, but are conditions very complex. So it's just to identify which are the context, okay? High pressure, complex condition, they are being tested by the audience, and it's all they also works under high uncertainty. So they try to focus on more visible aspects. But even though it's complicated to work under those conditions, usually the media commit some mistakes. And we can find a lot of publications related that usually the media incorrectly frames disaster, and they usually focus more on loss and destruction rather than reporting on key measures and checking on data. So after that, they built on a basis of naturalization of the hard situation that people are living during the disaster, and they focus on the suffering people instead of exploring the responsibilities of political, economic, and cultural actors related to that disaster. Well, I'm just check some what happened during disasters in Chile on 2010. There are a lot of complaints about how the media was reporting the earthquake. Then something happened very similar during the fires in Valparaiso in 2014. The National Television Council received a lot of complaints of the audience related to a particular situation that was a journalist that handed out 10,000 note to a little girl. So he received charts, and recently during the Viña del Mar fires, was a special situation related to a journalist who was interviewing a man who lost his house, and this fire happened 2 days before Christmas. So this journalist asked him how is he planning to celebrate Christmas night, Christmas Eve, sorry, and the National TV Council received 78%, well, 4,000, more than 4,000 complaints about the situation. So these examples are just to mention that usually in Chile, media has no too much idea how to face disaster and how to inform about them. And it's important to mention that after the fires of 2014, UNICEF prepared a report related to how they focus on the reporting on kids related to disasters, and they mentioned that ethics and rigor no more and no less are perhaps two of the fundamental elements that separate the duty to inform from the care and respect the victims deserve. So in that way, we need to do, it's important to understand, not just to identify that that we need to know what communities needs, and to know to stay safe. That's the main information they need to receive. It's important to, even that we are talking about a recovery phase, it's important to mention that we need to generate clear guidelines before disaster happens, to prepare communities about what they have to do in a hazard situation. That is an important role of communication. And in that way, it's important to prepare in advance the messages that we need to share. For example, well, what people should do in high risk of flood, where should displaced people go if they cannot find safe shelters? Well, to answer a lot of questions, to identify which are the best way to act after a disaster. So related to communication is important also, not just for authorities, not just for the media, also for each one of us. We also play a role during disaster, because any of us, if we live a disaster, we share information. And it's important to know that we need to check each news that we receive, not just for the TV, by the TV, also for the social media. So it's important to check, always to check, to recognize also the scientific data and the authorities' data. It's important to, if you're going to exchange information, you have to be very responsible on which information are you going to share. If you are not sure about, or you couldn't confirm the information, please do not share it. It's important also to avoid false information, to corroborate each source of information. All the time we are exposed to fake news, so it's important to do that exercise related to information about disaster. We need to be super careful about what we're going to share, and it's important to protect privacy. So to finish, don't forget that people must return to their reality. Understand that after disaster recovery phase, communication is so different from the times of calm. And also we need to focus on recommendations related to prevention and self-care. And we need to be very careful how to treat people. We need to treat as bereaved people, and people, what they need is emotional support. So in that way, we need to have very present that the most important ideas, or the main topic that we need to share about information, is about safety and hope. So that is my presentation. Well, there's my email if someone wants to write me or ask some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Magdalena. That was wonderful. I want to just take a minute to open up the floor. We have about 30 minutes or so to just ask questions of these really thoughtful presentations. If you can, you can raise your hand so I can see you. If you can turn on your camera when you talk, if you're comfortable with that, that's incredibly helpful to see who's talking. As we maybe gather our questions, Magdalena, I had a question just right off the bat about your presentation. You insinuated it at the end. There were three main things that journalists need to focus on and get when they're reporting on disasters. But I'm curious if you've identified where is the gap for them? Like, are there things that are keeping journalists from getting to those specific things that they need to maybe report successfully?
Well, first, it's important to mention that, I'm not sure if I mentioned before, but here in Chile, there are no risk communication at the journalism school. So there are few people who are researching about risk communication. And well, related to the gap that the question that you're making, I think the gap is because even that they don't have this topic at the university, also the medias and special TV, I think that is more often to identify this behavior in the TV. They don't understand which is the important focus to report during an emergency or during a disaster. Usually they try to, as a cite to the paper that I mentioned at the end, they focus on the more what are the suffering, what people are suffering, more than focus on what those people needs to know. So the gap is to understand which are the main things they need to be to identify during this situation, and also at the editors table at the media. You know that at the media works with a lot of people, and it's an editor who indicates which are the way they need to report. Usually they are thinking more in more clicks or more connections than which are the main information people need to know in that moment. So I think the gap is between the needs about the people who are the needs of the community, and the which are the importance for the media. Usually I mentioned that the media are enterprises. Sometimes they forgot about the social role that they need to play, not just in disaster, always. But I think to understand where the gap is related to this both situations, about which are the needs of the people and which are the interests of the enterprises.
That's great. Thank you so much. Claudine, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you both. Really amazing presentations. Elizabeth, in my second life, I think I'm going to be an architect. It was fascinating to see just more insight on shelters and emergency shelters. My question for you is, just because of my graduate degree, I learned about Harry Dreyfus, which is this, designer, product designer, and everything was based on his measurements of the average men, later to find out that women have a 73% more chance of getting injured in a car because the space is designed specifically for a kind of person. So I wanted to know, in your research with these emergency shelters, is there a user in mind? I'm in disability spaces right now. I'm really interested. I saw a lot of steps or little, even one step up. Is there an average user in mind with shelters and how it's built for a certain person?
Well, so I think it's very difficult to, it's not difficult, but the user in general is going to be a family of 4 where no disabilities is usually included and no gender. That's going to be the rule in most cases that I know. So it's a user, it's a neutral user. When we say neutral, we mean man at a certain, of course, certain size and everything. But there are groups studying that, and there are many organizations trying to include gender into the design of shelter. For example, it's very common in certain cases where the shelter is being built without a bathroom. So sanitary solution is going to be built, for example, for a group of people, and that in the past years have been banned in many countries because it's not going to provide the security for girls and for women to go there. So the inclusion of not the shelter, but the solution in the transitional settlement, we might say, is going to be included. So that from one side, from the gender perspective, in terms of security or safety too. And in terms of disabilities, again, it's also something that is being included in the past, let's say 10 years, something that is, we have some guidelines in terms of ramps, for example, also in terms of how people can access the shelter. But of course, in some cases, for example, they need to raise the shelter above ground because otherwise it's going to be flooded, especially in tropical areas. They need to be, like 50 centimeters from the ground, and that is going to be complicated, but still, and there are some guidelines to include some solutions that can be useful for people with disabilities. But those, as you can imagine, in terms of urban design and architecture, is something that is not new, of course. In the past 20 years, we have amazing people working in terms of gender in architecture, but it's not mainstream in terms of shelter solution yet.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Does anyone else have a question? Magdalena.
Yes, I have a question to Elizabeth. Just I want to know that the cases that you were researching about temporary housing and this the expanding of the houses are people who are not going to be able to receive a definitive or final housing from the Ministry of Housing, or do you identify different cases, people who are going to be receive a definitive, a final house, or people that are not going to receive the support from the Ministry of Housing?
Yeah. So I've been studying this for quite a long. So I studied the 2007 earthquake in Peru, in Pisco, then the 2010 earthquake in Chile, and now the case studies that the cases that I showed to you at the end in terms of home-based enterprise, home-based work, is in the Atacama region, in Diego de Almagro and in Terra Amarilla. And I studied in these two different cases where families, they have tenure and they can rebuild in their own plot. And also I have studied this in temporary settlements that are going to be demolished, or where families are going to be moved to a different place later if they can get permanent housing. In both cases, I have seen as soon as they can, they improve, they extend, they change the house. Like the second day they have the house, even though it can be a transitional space. So the families, they are not going to build or also to be able to build their permanent house in that place. They extend the house anyway, because it usually in 2010 it was 18 square meters. Now it's 24, which is bigger than before, but it still is not enough for a family of 4 in general, and still people need to accommodate other uses and rooms, and they have other necessities. So in both cases, that's why I said dignity, even though the families, they were extending and improving and adding different materials to the houses, even though they knew that they, in the future, that could be 2, 3, 5 years, 7, depending on the case, they will need to move, and they will need to destroy that house or to take it to a different place. The families, they extended the house anyway. So I've seen in both cases, it always happens. And it happens, as I said, as big as they can. So as soon as they have any material, they extend to the side and they add a new room. And they, especially, I'm not going to go very deep into this, but it's very different depending also into with the household composition. So you have a family of 4 and you have 2 adults and 2 young children. It's going to be different if they have the children, they start growing and you have then a teenager. And when you have a teenager, the families, they extend bigger because they need another room for the teenager to have their own space. So family composition also changes the way, the dynamics of the extension. And also if the extension is going to be used for a different use, as I showed, for example, for a shop or for a service, or if the family is going to have any type of enterprise inside the temporary shelter. But as I said, tenure or the possibility of applying to a subsidy in the future is not something that changes, but people, they extend anyway, in any case. Thanks.
Clinton, I see your hand is raised. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you both for really great, thought-provoking presentations there. I just a comment first of the kind of the contrast between the two projects. With my impression, Elizabeth, is that when the interventions we see in the housing, because there's so many outside resources that come in, agencies and response groups, it's very different than, Magdalena, your setting, where the media, the communication happens with existing local journalists and things like that. And that seems to be a really foundational difference from a design standpoint of where we focus. And I guess my question is for Magdalena. You inspired me to think about, when we're working with communities in our projects, to include the media, the local media, the local people that would share and talk because of their critical role. I guess my question is kind of around that. How do you tactically, how do you see that taking place? What tools maybe don't exist that would be helpful in that space? Or maybe just share a little bit about your experience of how the advice and the recommendations get disseminated in that setting.
Well, it's very important what you mentioned, because local actors, in special local media, they play an important role, because as I mentioned, the people affected by disasters need to identify they need credibility. So if they identify a voice or a face related to a local media, they are going to trust in him or in her. So it's very important to identify which are these local actors or local journalists or local communicators that are going to be important for people affected. So in that way, for any project related to risk reduction, it's important to identify which are these local actors can be recognized by audience. So first, to define a communication strategy, you need to identify first which are the media people use to receive information. Also, you need to identify the media, which are the different audience, because you're not going to communicate the same way to a young community or for or adults. They use different ways, are different media. First, you need to identify which are these different channels they use to inform, and then you need to create messages. As I mentioned in my presentation, even that you identify different ways to inform during each phase of the disaster. To apply during recovery phase, you need to create before the disaster happens, which is going to be the strategy. So in that way, you need to create or think about the messages you're going to share with community, and that is very important to work together. So because maybe just in case, just to mention a case, you can ask me, Magdalena, can you design a communication strategy? Okay, but I'm going to study these communities, but it's more important to work with them. So because they know which are the safety areas, they know how which where adults or people with disabilities lives. So that is the best way to work on a communication strategy, to work together with the community exposed to different hazards.
Thanks for that question, Clinton. Rodrigo.
Well, thank you both, Elizabeth and Magdalena, for your inspiring presentations. It sparked a lot of ideas. I'm not sure now I have a question. I have like a comment, and I will try to convert this into a question. Elizabeth, you mentioned that communities try to recover after the sudden change and after a massive change. They recover with the tools that they have sometimes available, with the help of the authority, the ministries or the local authorities. But what do you think about this vernacular sense of creativity that they bring? Because I would like to take this into the emotional part of relief. Trying to reconnect with the places that I like, the spaces of my everyday house that I love or I enjoy a lot. Probably my garden, or what do you think about these emotional connections? And for Magdalena, then Magdalena, you mentioned also that there are challenges in information, how we can manage this information during the emergency. But I was thinking in the same question, if everyone needs and is searching for information, what we can also connect with their sense of connection beyond the technology access or the recovery of the mobile signal, how we can reconnect with the emotions, with the sense of being part of a community. As I mentioned in my introduction, I wasn't sure that I have a question, probably, but I would like to touch these emotional parts of your work, if you have any idea to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Yes, I have many ideas regarding that. Especially because in many cases NGOs or even the government, they don't have the capacity to know what happened later, what is happening 2, 3, 4 years after they provided the house, because they, as I said, they don't have the capacity, or it's not in their mandate. So they just provide what is needed at that point, and then that's it. So they don't know in many cases how the families are going to rebuild, to recover, or how they're going to use those houses. In my experience, this is that process, the emotional part is very important. Is the process of homemaking is very important. And for example, I have like few examples of that. In the Tato, after the 2010 earthquake and tsunami, I remember like interviewing some families, and one of them, they had a very nice facade made out of timber blocks, and I asked the family, so what is this facade about? It's a new siding, it's not the timber shack that provided the government. And they said, well, we recovered the parts that we could from the house that was destroyed, and they cut the pieces and they used that for the facade. And also they showed me some furniture that they created inside the house with parts of the destroyed house. Because for the families, the emotional part also was very, very important. For some of them, they lived in, for example, in the lost, the destroyed house for don't know, 2 generations. So they said, well, I remember when my grandfather, they built, you know, they built that house, and so we really wanted to bring some of that into our transitional house, which is, again, something, it's not going to be permanent, it's going to be something in between, but it's still for families knowing that they are going to stay there for 2, 3 or more years sometimes. They needed to make this space their own home, and to include that time of the type of emotional part into the house. So Magdalena, I don't know, your turn.
Well, it's not easy to answer about what Rodrigo asked, because first you're talking to people who lost maybe everything what they have. So if they are vulnerable after disaster, they are more vulnerable than before. So you need to be super careful about how you're going to work with them in any way, not just, for example, to communicate. Also, for example, if you need to work about the emergency housing, you need to be super careful about if you identify if they are going to receive one of this housing, or if they are not able to receive. So in that way, what is going to happen with them? So I'm just mentioning this because we just this just happened during the wildfires in the summer in February in Chile, and it's complicated because you need to think about their feelings. As I started my presentation explaining that communication is related to share some codes, you need to think about what is the code they are going to understand, which is the code that I need to share with them, and it's related about information. And in that case, which are the codes that I'm going to share, we need to link them with the feelings. And in that way, the examples also I mentioned about this journalist giving money to a little girl, or also this journalist that she were asking about how this guy is planning to celebrate Christmas. It's horrible because they are not thinking about how the other one is feeling in that moment, what they are having. So even that could sound that, well, they need to think about it, but not all the time. Who are communicating or who are just playing a role to share that code, in that case, journalists, they think in that way. So first, I forgot to mention, but it's important to incorporate a human rights approach in all the communicating cycle in each phase. That I think is the first step where you need to think about how you're going to communicate and how you're going to share information. Human rights. You need to be very careful about this approach in your work.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. I have a question from Magdalena. And I really like your presentation when you mentioned that information is relevant, of course, for to provide support, but also I think in terms of coordination and how the funding is being provided. I've seen difference in process of recovery. I'm thinking 2 organized communities after the wildfires in Santa Olga in the south of Chile, and the other after the 2015 case that we are studying in Atacama. And it's very different the ways they achieve the process of recovery. In both cases happened with 2 years of difference and under the same leaders in government. So it shouldn't be that different. But in one case, they achieved already permanent housing in less than 5 years. And in the other community, they are still living transitional housing. And of course, there are many layers to explain this, but certainly I feel that media coverage in one case might have had an influence in donors and organizations and government resources. So I would like to know your approach or your opinion on this. Have you seen differences regarding how media coverage or how the media is, showing one case with more detail or maybe more extreme than others, and that means that at the end the recovery is going to be different in different cases?
Well, I think that the difference could be explained by the time that the disaster happened. For example, the 2015 floods. No, it's not floods. It's landslide.
Landslides.
Happened in which months happened? In March?
May.
And Santa Olga and were different governments. No, was the same. Bachelet. Was the same Bachelet. And I think maybe I just talking it's not my an explanation, but I think that as Santa Olga happened during summertime, and there are less news during that period, that months, because usually during February, politics are on holidays. And if you can analyze the news agenda or the public agenda about which are the topics covered by the news, you can identify that during February you have less activity at the Congress, at the government. So the media focus on which more interest on disaster happened during that month, during January and especially February. And Santa Olga happened during February of 2017. Could be an explanation. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking about what influenced on how they can manage these disasters. Could be it's a thesis, but it could be that reason. As during summer, the media is focused on this kind of disasters. They have more attention, so that can sensibilize more people to donate, to activate different networks. So could be an explanation. Comparing with the other one that happened in May of 2015, during that time you have the Congress working, and could be, I'm not sure, but as you ask me in this moment, I think that could be an explanation. Not sure, but could be that. Because if we compare with the fires that happened this February, something similar happened. That was February, the president came back from his holidays, as the Congress was were not working. So could be an explanation, not sure about that. Could be an important topic to research together.
Thank you for that. Is it Jocelyn?
Hello, thank you for both presentations. Hi, Magdalena. I have two questions. First of all, if you have considered the use of qualitative or social research methodologies to improve or evaluate the solutions that are provided. For both.
Well, yeah, Magdalena, you want to, or?
Well, of course, if you're talking about communication, it's important to focus
Yes.
on the quality data.
Qualitative.
qualitative. Sorry, sorry. Sometimes my English it's not the best, but yes, in Chile, it's quite difficult to find too much research about risk communication. There are some efforts and good efforts related to, for example, Soledad Puente, Daniela Grisó. Also, Rodrigo is working on related to emergency communication, but it's not the and the main topic related to research about communication. You can find some research, but it's important to identify this qualitative information to compare about, and especially what we were talking about before, about feelings, about the vulnerability. So maybe it's also it's a challenge to social scientists to research focus on this qualitative data to improve results about risk communication, especially.
Yeah, so in my work, we work with a sociologist, and so we do interdisciplinary work, both from using qualitative social research. So we make interviews basically to understand how the families understand home production, the gender relations inside the house and with the community. So we make interviews, the houses. We also use a focus group. And so it's something that we do, especially in our research. Of course, we also have some quantitative information and data, but in general, the work that we do in my projects always includes social research.
Thank you. My second question. How should intersectoral work to reconstruction be developed? Because I think one thing is the housing, but other critical infrastructure is affected, and we talk, Magdalena, this in Uruguay, but I think it's a gap there in the planning, in the thinking, and we have response so different for the many sectors we can work.
Well, I think that the problem is that the new law that creates the new institutional support that creates the national system to prevent disasters, as we change from a national office for emergencies, and now we have a national system and a national service. We have a new law that creates a new institutional framework. And the problem is that the new law doesn't incorporate the recovery process. It just identifies the mitigation, preparation, and just the response, but it doesn't include all the process related to recovery. So there's the work that the Ministry of Housing needs to work on it to present a national policy for recovery in 2 years more. But I think it's a problem, as we don't have this institutional framework or to organize a recovery policy. It's very complicated to coordinate intersectoral work, because each ministry, each sector works on what they used to work. For example, in health, you used to rebuild the I don't know how to say, to the CESFAM or all those community spaces for
primary care facilities.
Thanks. And also, Mr. Housing, rebuild houses are also think about the urban how to think about the territory, and education think about how they're going to present solutions for students. But it's important to identify that we need to coordinate in a better way this process of recovery. I think there's a way now, because the new institution presents this COGRID, that is a committee that presents all the this COGRID is the emergency.
No, we're having trouble hearing you, Magdalena. No, still can't.
Then?
Trying? Yep, got you now.
Oh, okay, sorry. No, I was mentioned that even that we don't have a national recovery policy, there is the National Committee for Disaster and Emergencies, COGRID is in Spanish, Comité de Gestión de Riesgos y Desastres, that can lead the process of recovery. And the problem is that it's a new law. The law started the last year, so we need to improve on how we are going to apply this new institutional framework. So it's important to work on it, how we are going to coordinate different sectors, the intersectoral work. So it's a challenge.
All right, thank you so much for all the thoughtful questions and answers and dialogue. We are at time. I'm going to turn it over to Clinton and Rodrigo to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you to Magdalena, Elizabeth. Thank you for the time you put into this, and just the vantage point you brought to all of us that participated. I know we'll be working on the translations of this, and it'll be recorded, and we'll post it on our website and YouTube, and make it available for those that couldn't make it, and also those that maybe want to review some of that. So just thank you for a great session that I think personally for Rodrigo and I really brought up a lot of thoughtful points. Rodrigo?
Completely agree. Thank you both, Elizabeth and Magdalena, for a fantastic session today. Good questions, good dialogue. After your projects, your talks have sparked a lot of new ideas, I hope, for your own work also. And thank you, Emily, for the impeccable work of moderation today. I would like just to say thanks also to Sigiden, to the DNEM, but specifically to Bernardita, Javiera, and Jason, that are our collaborators, that these roundtables would not be able to happen if not having their work. So many thanks, and well, see you in the next session. The next session, we hope, will be about the volcanic risks communication. So stay in touch. And join us again in the next session. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.